June 3, 1943. The Solomon Islands. Dawn arrives not as a revelation, but as a slow leak of gray light across waters the color of tarnished silver. The air is thick, saturated with moisture that clings to skin and metal alike, turning every breath into an effort. On a narrow beach at Rendova Island, a peculiar sight takes shape through the mist. A Bell P-39 Airacobra fighter, its sleek fuselage stripped of wings, mounted impossibly on the deck of a landing craft barely 40 feet long. The engine nacelle, normally housing the aircraft's distinctive mid-mounted Allison engine, has been gutted and refitted. Where once a propeller spun at 3,000 revolutions per minute, there is now only empty space, a hollow cavity that seems to defy the aircraft's purpose. But the gun remains. The 37mm M4 cannon, protruding from the spinner hub like the fong of some mechanical predator, is intact, functional, and aimed directly at the jungle tree line 200 yards distant. The men of the 43rd Infantry Division who constructed this hybrid monstrosity have not slept in 36 hours. Their hands are raw from handling welding torches and steel cable. Their uniforms are stained with oil, salt, and the red mud that characterizes every Pacific island where Americans have chosen to make a stand. They do not speak as they make final adjustments to the mounting bolts. There is nothing to say. The improvisation they have created, this marriage of aviation and naval engineering, this fusion of desperation and ingenuity, exists because conventional weapons have failed. The Japanese bunkers dug into the coral ridges above Munda Point have withstood weeks of naval bombardment, aerial strafing, and direct infantry assault. Concrete and steel, reinforced with layers of coconut logs and coral aggregate, have turned each fortification into a tomb that swallows artillery shells without yielding. The Americans need something different, something unexpected, something that will punch through 2 feet of reinforced concrete at point-blank range. So they mounted a fighter plane on a boat, and in doing so, they created fear. To understand this moment, one must first understand the weapon at its center. The P-39 Airacobra was an aircraft born from ambition and compromised by reality. Designed by Bell Aircraft Corporation in the late 1930s, it represented a radical departure from conventional fighter design. The engine was positioned behind the pilot, connected to the propeller by a long drive shaft that ran beneath the cockpit floor. This configuration allowed engineers to mount a cannon, not a machine gun, but a true cannon, firing through the propeller hub. The 37mm M4 could destroy a tank, punch through a locomotive, or tear apart a concrete pillbox with a single well-placed round. On paper, the P-39 was a revolutionary weapons platform. In practice, it was a disappointment. At high altitude, where the war in Europe was fought, the Airacobra struggled. It lacked a supercharger, and its performance above 15,000 feet was anemic. American and British pilots who flew it in the European theater found themselves outclassed by German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The aircraft earned a reputation as a death trap, a beautiful machine that could not deliver on its promise. Hundreds were diverted to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program, where they performed better in the low-altitude fighting on the Eastern Front. But in the Pacific, where the United States desperately needed every available aircraft, the P-39 found a different kind of service. It became a ground attack platform, strafing Japanese positions, supporting infantry advances, hunting barges and supply depots along the coastlines. And occasionally, when circumstances demanded, it became something else entirely. The idea to mount aircraft weapons on landing craft emerged from the grinding, brutal nature of the island-hopping campaign. After Guadalcanal, after Tarawa, after the blood-soaked beaches and coral ridges that measured American progress in yards rather than miles, military planners understood that conventional tactics were insufficient. The Japanese had perfected the art of defensive fortification. Their bunkers were not merely dug into the earth. They were architectural achievements, engineered with meticulous care, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that turned every landing into a killing ground. Naval gunfire support, while impressive in its destructive power, lacked precision. A battleship firing from 10 miles offshore could obliterate an acre of jungle, but it could not guarantee a direct hit on a bunker entrance 3 feet wide. Airstrikes were similarly limited. Dive bombers could deliver heavy ordnance, But the jungle canopy concealed targets, and bombs often detonated in the treetops, their force dissipated before reaching the fortifications below. What was needed was direct fire. Close range, point-blank accuracy. The ability to put a high-velocity round exactly where it needed to go, not from 10,000 feet or 10 miles, but from 200 yards. And that required putting the weapon on the water, close to shore, stable enough to aim, mobile enough to maneuver. Enter the P-39. Or more precisely, enter the forward fuselage section of a P-39, salvaged from an aircraft damaged beyond flight, but still mechanically intact. The cannon remained functional. The ammunition feed system worked. The trigger mechanism could be adapted. What the fuselage lacked were wings, tail, and engine, components unnecessary for a weapon that would never leave the ground. Or in this case, the water. The landing craft chosen for this experiment was an LCVP, landing craft, vehicle, personnel, commonly known as the Higgins boat. Designed by Andrew Higgins in New Orleans, these boats were the workhorses of the Pacific campaign. 36 feet long, with a shallow draft that allowed them to approach beaches where larger vessels could not venture, they could carry 36 troops or a jeep, disgorge their cargo through a bow ramp, and retreat to deeper water. They were simple, reliable, and ubiquitous. Thousands were built, and now, one of them was being transformed into an improvised gunboat. The engineering challenge was considerable. The P-39's fuselage weighed over 2,000 pounds, even stripped of non-essential components. Mounting it on the deck of a landing craft required welding a reinforced steel frame to distribute the weight, preventing the boat from capsizing or breaking apart under the recoil of the cannon. The gun itself generated enormous forces when fired. Each 37mm shell weighed over a pound and left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The recoil, if not properly managed, could tear the mounting free or crack the boat's wooden hull. The solution involved shock absorbers salvaged from vehicle suspensions, rubber padding, and a complex system of bracing that turned the landing craft into a hybrid of shipyard and junkyard ingenuity. But the weapon worked. In trials conducted at Rendova, the P-39 equipped landing craft fired test rounds into abandoned Japanese positions. The results exceeded expectations. The 37mm armor-piercing shells penetrated concrete with ease, detonating inside bunkers and collapsing reinforced structures that had resisted weeks of conventional bombardment. The high-explosive rounds, designed to fragment upon impact, turned the interior of fortifications into whirlwinds of shrapnel. And critically, the boat's mobility allowed it to approach targets from unexpected angles, maneuvering along the coastline to engage bunkers that were protected from frontal assault. The Japanese soldiers entrenched in the hills above Munda did not immediately understand what they were facing. They had grown accustomed to the rhythm of American attacks, the preliminary naval bombardment, the airstrikes, the infantry assault. They knew the sounds of these weapons, the distant thunder of battleship guns, the shriek of dive bombers, the staccato chatter of machine guns. They had learned to endure, to hunker down in their bunkers, to wait out the storm, and then emerge to fight. Their doctrine emphasized spiritual resilience, the belief that willpower and discipline could overcome material disadvantage. They were taught that the Americans were soft, dependent on machinery, lacking the martial spirit necessary for victory in close combat. Then they saw the boat. It approached from the south, moving slowly through the coastal shallows, its outline distorted by the morning haze. At first, it appeared to be an ordinary landing craft, perhaps carrying troops or supplies. But as it drew closer, the silhouette resolved into something alien, something that violated the categories of war as they understood them. A plane, on a boat, not being transported, but mounted, aimed, ready to fire. The cognitive dissonance was immediate. Aircraft belonged in the sky. Boats belonged on the water. The fusion of the two was unnatural, a perversion of the order that defined naval and aerial warfare. The Japanese machine gunners in the nearest bunker opened fire. Tracer rounds arced across the water, splashing around the landing craft, sparking off the P-39's armored fuselage. The boat did not retreat. It adjusted its position, angling to present the cannon directly at the bunker's firing slit. There was a moment of suspended time, a heartbeat where the world seemed to pause. Then the 37mm cannon fired. The sound was unlike anything the soldiers had heard. Not the crack of a rifle or the boom of a howitzer, but a sharp, percussive bark that seemed to compress the air itself. The shell crossed the distance in a fraction of a second, struck the concrete face of the bunker 2 inches below the firing slit, and detonated. The explosion was contained, concentrated, the force channeled into the structure rather than dissipating into the open air. Coral dust erupted from the impact point. Cracks spiderwebbed across the concrete. A second round followed, striking the same location, widening the breach. The third round penetrated, entering the bunker and exploding inside. The machine gun fell silent. The landing craft moved to the next target. And the next. Over the course of 3 hours, it systematically engaged 7 fortified positions along the Munda coastline, reducing structures that had resisted weeks of bombardment. The Japanese defenders, observing from deeper positions in the hills, felt something shift. It was not merely the loss of specific bunkers, though that was tactically significant. It was the realization that the Americans had found a way to adapt, to improvise, to turn their material abundance into solutions for problems that doctrine said should not have solutions. This was the emotional contrast, the rupture in expectation. Japanese military training emphasized consistency, discipline, adherence to established tactics. Soldiers were taught to master specific weapons and employ them according to prescribed methods. Innovation was the province of officers and engineers, not frontline troops. The idea that ordinary soldiers, mechanics, welders, infantry engineers, could disassemble an aircraft, mount its weapon on a boat, and create a functional weapons system in a matter of days was antithetical to the Japanese understanding of military hierarchy. It suggested a kind of chaotic creativity, a disregard for proper procedure, that was simultaneously impressive and unsettling. The Americans, for their part, did not see their improvisation as revolutionary. It was simply necessary. The P-39 was available. The landing craft was available. The problem, heavily fortified bunkers, required a solution. The solution was engineered, tested, and deployed. No formal approval from higher command was sought until after the weapon had proven itself in combat. This was not insubordination. It was initiative, the product of a military culture that valued results over adherence to doctrine, that empowered junior officers and enlisted men to solve problems with the resources at hand. The recurring symbol of this story is the cannon itself, the 37mm M4, a weapon designed for one purpose and adapted to another. Originally conceived as an anti-tank gun, meant to defeat German armor on European battlefields, it found itself in the Pacific, mounted on an aircraft, then removed from the aircraft and mounted on a boat, firing at concrete bunkers dug into coral islands. The cannon's journey mirrored the American military's own transformation, a force designed to fight one kind of war, suddenly thrust into a different conflict, adapting, improvising, repurposing everything it had to meet the demands of the moment. The gun was abundance made manifest. Not the abundance of overwhelming numbers, though the United States would eventually deploy that as well, but the abundance of options, the capacity to take a tool designed for purpose A and make it serve purpose B, to see potential where doctrine saw only limitation. The Japanese military, for all its courage and tactical skill, lacked this flexibility. Resources were scarce. Every weapon had its assigned role. Deviation from established procedure was discouraged. When a tactic failed, the response was to execute it with greater determination, greater sacrifice, not to abandon it in favor of something new. The P-39, mounted landing craft, crude and ungainly as it was, represented a different philosophy. It said, "We will use what we have. We will break the rules if the rules are insufficient. We will build something new if nothing old will serve. And we will do it not because we are desperate, though we often are, but because we believe in the power of human ingenuity to overcome obstacles." In the weeks following the Munda operation, word of the improvised gunboats spread through the Pacific theater. Other units began experimenting with similar adaptations. Aircraft cannons were mounted on Amtraks, on trucks, on makeshift platforms built into the sides of patrol boats. A 75mm pack howitzer, normally carried disassembled on mules, was welded to the deck of a destroyer escort and used to provide close fire support during the Polilliu landings. A flamethrower intended for use by infantry engineers was adapted to fit inside a Sherman tank, creating the M4A3R3 Zippo, capable of incinerating Japanese cave positions from behind armor. The pattern repeated across the theater: identify a problem, find available resources, build a solution, test it, refine it, deploy it. The Japanese observed these improvisations with a mixture of admiration and dread. Captured diaries and post-war interviews reveal a recurring theme. The Americans were unpredictable. They did not fight according to established patterns. They adapted too quickly. Their abundance of material allowed them to experiment, to waste resources on ideas that might fail, to try again when they did. For soldiers trained in a culture where material scarcity was a fact of life, where every bullet and every grain of rice had to be conserved, this profligacy was both alien and terrifying. But it was not merely a matter of resources. The psychological dimension was equally important. The sight of a P-39 mounted on a boat was absurd, almost comical. It violated aesthetic expectations, the sense that military equipment should look purposeful, integrated, designed. The improvised gunboat looked like something assembled in a scrapyard, which in a sense it was. And yet it worked. It was functional. It killed. The absurdity was part of the weapon's power. It destabilized assumptions, introduced doubt. If the Americans could do this, mount a plane on a boat, turn a fighter into a naval weapon, what else were they capable of? What other rules would they break? This psychological effect extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Japanese high command, receiving reports of American improvisations, faced a strategic dilemma. Their war plans were predicated on the assumption that the United States, while materially strong, was doctrinally rigid, slow to adapt, dependent on centralized planning. The island-hopping campaign was supposed to bog down, to drain American resources and morale, to turn the Pacific into a quagmire where material superiority meant nothing. But the improvisations, the P-39 gunboats, the tank-mounted flamethrowers, the adaptation of naval artillery for ground support, suggested that the Americans were learning faster than anticipated, that they were not constrained by doctrine in the way Japanese planners had expected. The transformation was not limited to tactics. It reflected a deeper change in American military culture. At the start of the war, the United States military was small, under-equipped, and largely untested in modern warfare. The interwar years had been marked by budget cuts, isolationist sentiment, and a focus on defensive preparations rather than offensive capability. The industrial capacity existed, but the organizational structures and tactical doctrines were underdeveloped. Pearl Harbor shattered complacency. The defeats at Bataan and Corregidor, the loss of the Philippines, the slow grinding battles at Guadalcanal. These were not merely tactical setbacks, but learning experiences that forced a reckoning with the realities of modern war. The soldiers who welded a P-39 fuselage to a landing craft were not professional engineers. They were mechanics, construction workers, farmhands, men conscripted from civilian life, given basic training, and thrown into combat. But they brought with them the problem-solving skills of a society built on pragmatism, on fixing broken machinery, on making do with what was available. This was the culture of the Great Depression, where scarcity bred ingenuity, where families survived by repurposing, repairing, and improvising. That same ethos, transplanted to the battlefield, became a strategic asset. Historical evidence for the impact of these improvisations is scattered but compelling. After-action reports from the Munda campaign note that Japanese resistance collapsed more rapidly than anticipated once the improvised gunboats were deployed. Intelligence assessments from captured documents reveal confusion among Japanese commanders about American tactics, repeated references to unconventional weapons, and unexpected fire support. Post-war interrogations of Japanese officers frequently mentioned the psychological impact of American material abundance. Not just the quantity of weapons, but the variety, the constant introduction of new solutions to tactical problems. One particularly telling account comes from a Japanese infantry captain captured on Bougainville in late 1943. In his interrogation, translated and filed in the National Archives, he describes the American approach to warfare as a confusion of methods, without discipline or order, yet strangely effective. He goes on, "They do not fight as we were taught an army should fight. They change their tactics constantly. They build weapons we have never seen. They do not seem to care if their methods are proper, only if they work. This is not the behavior of a disciplined force. And yet they win. The captain's confusion is understandable. He was trained in a military tradition that valued consistency, mastery, perfection. The idea that effectiveness could emerge from chaos, that a hastily improvised weapon could outperform a carefully designed fortification, challenged his understanding of what war was supposed to be. But that was precisely the point. The Americans were not fighting the war they were supposed to fight. They were fighting the war as it was, not as doctrine said it should be. The epilogue of the P-39 gunboat is less dramatic than its debut. The improvised weapons served their purpose during the Solomon Islands campaign, then were largely abandoned as more conventional solutions became available. Purpose-built gunboats, properly designed amphibious fire support vehicles, and improved artillery tactics eventually rendered the improvisation unnecessary. The landing craft that carried the P-39 cannon was likely stripped of its unusual armament, returned to its original role as a troop transport, and eventually lost to the attrition of the war, sunk, scrapped, or left to rot on some forgotten beach. But the idea persisted. The willingness to improvise, to break rules, to mount a plane on a boat if that was what the situation required, became embedded in American military culture. It influenced post-war doctrine, shaped the development of new weapons systems, and informed the approach to future conflicts. The lesson was clear. Doctrine is a guide, not a straitjacket. When reality diverges from the plan, adapt. Use what you have. Build what you need. Don't wait for permission. This is the larger truth about freedom, the connection that links a hastily welded gunboat to the broader arc of democratic ideology. Freedom, in the American conception, is not merely the absence of constraint. It is the presence of possibility, the belief that individuals can solve problems, that innovation can emerge from the bottom up, that the solution to a challenge might come from a mechanic on a beach rather than a general in a headquarters. The Japanese military, for all its discipline and courage, was trapped by hierarchy. Initiative flowed downward, from command to execution. The role of the individual soldier was to obey, to execute orders with precision, to die with honor if required. The American military, by contrast, was chaotic, informal, frequently disorganized. Salutes were often forgotten. Regulations were bent. Sergeants argued with lieutenants. And yet, from this apparent disorder emerged a capacity for innovation that the Japanese, with all their discipline, could not match. The P-39 gunboat was not invented by a committee or sanctioned by a manual. It was built by men who saw a problem and a solution in the same glance, who had the tools and the freedom to act on their idea, who trusted that if it worked, no one would ask too many questions about proper procedure. This is what democracy at war looks like. Not flags and anthems and grand speeches, though those have their place, but improvisation, pragmatism, the belief that a good idea can come from anywhere, that the rank on a collar matters less than the quality of the solution, that war is too important to be left entirely to doctrine. The sound of the 37mm cannon, that sharp bark that echoed across the waters of Rendova, became for the soldiers who heard it a kind of signature, a calling card of American ingenuity. In the years after the war, veterans would recall that sound with a mixture of pride and bemusement. Pride, because it represented something they had accomplished, a weapon they had built with their own hands. Bemusement, because it was absurd, a fighter plane on a boat, a solution that should not have worked but did. And in that absurdity lies the poetry. War is supposed to be ordered, comprehensible, governed by rules and logic. But the reality is chaos, confusion, the constant improvisation required to survive. The P-39 gunboat was a monument to that chaos, a recognition that survival often depends not on following the plan, but on abandoning it in favor of something no one thought to plan for. June 3, 1943. The Solomon Islands. A fighter plane mounted on a boat. A cannon aimed at a bunker. The crack of the gun, the dust rising from shattered concrete, the silence that followed. It was a small moment in a vast war, a tactical innovation that would be forgotten by history books focused on larger battles and grander strategies. But for the men who built it, who fired it, who witnessed what it could do, it was a revelation. It was proof that freedom is not an abstraction, not a principle to be defended in speeches, but a practical reality, a capacity to act, to create, to turn the impossible into the merely difficult. The Japanese soldier in his bunker, watching that boat approach, seeing the plane that should not be there, hearing the gun that should not fire. He felt fear. Not merely the fear of death, which was familiar, but the fear of the unknown, the realization that the enemy was not predictable, not bound by the rules that made war comprehensible. The fear that no matter how well prepared, no matter how disciplined, the Americans would find a way to surprise him, to bring some new weapon or new tactic that he had not anticipated. That fear, in the end, was more powerful than any gun. It was the fear of an enemy who refused to be pinned down, who would not fight the war as it was supposed to be fought, who would mount a plane on a boat simply because it might work. It was the fear of abundance, not merely of material, but of ideas, of possibilities, of the relentless creativity that democracy, for all its flaws, tends to nurture. And when the cannon fell silent, when the last bunker was reduced to rubble and the landing craft withdrew to deeper water, that fear remained. It followed the Japanese soldiers as they retreated into the hills, as they dug new fortifications, as they prepared for the next American assault. It whispered to them in the night, a voice that said, "They will come again, and they will bring something new, something you have not seen, something you cannot predict." Fear followed. And in the Pacific War, in that long struggle across coral atolls and jungle islands, fear was as potent a weapon as any cannon ever forged.